Okay, in this video I'm going to answer 3 questions for you under the guise of solving quadratic equations by factoring. Okay, so I'm going to cover the following things. What is a quadratic equation? What are the different parts of a quadratic equation? Now, you can call it just a quadratic. And then how do I solve a quadratic by factoring? Okay, so what is a quadratic equation? The simplest answer to that is a quadratic equation has a degree of 2. And here's the simplest one that you'll see. If the exponent is 2, you have a quadratic. Okay? It's also called the degree. Now there is some difference between a degree and an exponent, but we're not going to go into that right now. But for here right now, x squared is equal to y is a quadratic equation. And you have a bunch of different kinds. Okay? Now remember, we just did a whole section on factoring. With binomials and trinomials especially, you can have quadratic equations. Let me just give you a quick example of what those look like. So I could have something like x squared minus 4 is equal to y. Or I could have something like x squared plus 2x plus 1 is equal to y. Okay? As long as I have a degree of 2, or an exponent of 2, I've got a quadratic equation. Now the other thing you need to know about a quadratic equation is that the graph of a quadratic equation is a parabola. Okay? So it either looks like that or it can look like that. Now you can have sideways ones, but that's for a different class. We're not going to cover that in this Algebra 1 or Algebra 2. Alright, so parabolas has a degree of 2. Now you get some other information from the degree of 2. The 2 tells you, the degree tells you, I should say, how many times your parabola could cross the y-axis. So the degree tells you how many times your parabola could cross the x-axis. Now, why is that important? Well, just real quickly, let me show you 3 possibilities, okay? I could cross twice. I could cross once. Or I could cross not at all. Okay, so the 2 tells you that the maximum number you could cross with a parabola is 2 times. And then these are other possibilities. We'll cover these in a different video. What do these look like? Because they're all predictable. Okay? So again, quadratic equation, degree of 2. What are the different parts of a quadratic equation? Now I want to teach you something called the standard form for a quadratic. The standard form for a quadratic equation is this: ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to a y. Now, this is for a quadratic, okay? Do you remember the standard form for a linear equation? Remember, it was like ax plus by was equal to c, and you can ignore the fact that those are capital. But remember, both you had the x and the y on the same side. Quadratic is a little bit different. You got the x's on one side, the y is equal to this side over here. But what's kind of important about the standard form for a quadratic is each of these individual terms tells you some important information. Okay, so let's go through what the different parts are. Where you have the square, that's called your quadratic term. Because really, if you lost the other 2 forms, you would still have a quadratic, just like the one I showed you up here. Okay, so this tells you that you're going to get a parabola as long as you got a degree of 2. The bx, that's called the linear term. And that makes a little bit of sense, right? Because if you look over here, it would be something like bx is equal to y. That would be a straight line. So that's why they call those linear terms. The c is called the constant term. And there's some information you can get from that. We'll cover it here in a little bit. And then the y Now, the y is kind of an interesting thing. When you're solving quadratic equations, you have to make your y equal to 0. Now, why is that? Okay, and that's not a pun. Why is that? Why is that? Let me show you real quick. So if I've got an x-y axis, and I've got a quadratic equation, and I'm solving for x, basically what I'm doing is I'm solving for where this quadratic equation crosses the x-axis. That's really all I'm solving for when I solve for this. But where does it cover? Where does it cross the x-axis? Where my y value is 0. Remember that? This is 0 is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 0, -1, -2, -3, -4, etc., etc. So where y is 0 is where I'll find my x values. So it's really important to make sure that this is equal to 0, okay, when you solve your quadratic equation. Now, let's go ahead and answer the last question. How do I solve a simple one by factoring? All right, I'm going to give you a simple one. Let's say x squared minus 3x minus 10 is equal to 0. All right. Now, by factor, you'll recognize that trinomial where the leading coefficient is 1. You should be able to ask yourself, what are the two factors of negative 10 that add up to negative 3? And the answer would be what? X minus 5, x plus 2. Right? Because that times that is negative 10. That plus that is negative 3. Let's bring the x's down. Now, look at something. In order for this times this to be equal to 0, one of these has to be 0. Right? Otherwise, you're not going to be able to get 0 as an answer. If one of your factors is not 0, you can't get 0 for an answer. That's called the zero property of multiplication. In order to get, basically the zero property says in order to get 0, one of your factors has to be 0. Now, which one is it? We just don't know. So you're going to cover both of your bases and solve for both of them. So you're going to say x minus 5 is 0, or x plus 2 is 0. It's one or the other. So solve for it. Let's add 5 to both sides, and you get x is equal to 5. And if you plugged it in there, you'd say 5 minus 5 is 0, 5 plus 7 is 7, 0 times 7 is 0, so it works. Or it could be what? Let's subtract 2. Negative 2. Again, plug it back in. Negative 2 plus 2 is 0, and then negative 2 minus is negative 7. So negative 7 times 0 is still 0. These are the two possibilities. Now, look what this tells us about our parabola. For this particular equation, this says that my x value is at positive 5. My parabola crosses there, or it crosses at negative 2. Okay? Now, what it doesn't tell us is a couple things. It doesn't tell us whether our parabola looks like this. It doesn't tell you whether it looks like this. It doesn't tell you whether there's like a really big dip there or a really shallow dip right there. It doesn't tell you any of those things, but it does tell you that it crosses there and there. And for right now, that's good enough. Okay, so I hope that was helpful. Again, a quadratic has a degree of 2, so that's what that tells you. And it also tells you how many times your parabola crosses the x-axis. The different parts are the quadratic term, the linear term, the constant term, and then the y, which you need to make 0. Okay? And then finally, how do you solve one by factoring? You solve it by factoring it, and then you make it equal to 0, and then you use the zero property of multiplication to solve where it crosses. Okay, I hope that was helpful to you.